All right, we're going to get started today with our daily kind of stand-up that we're doing from a Persimmon perspective. I'm Bill Fournet, CEO and founder of Persimmon. For those who are joining us for the first time, first, welcome. And I have everyone muted, both from an audio as well as from a video perspective. If you want to join into the conversation or have a question or you want to add, feel free to do so by either adding it into the chat, and I have Corey from my team who is helping me moderate today. The way we approach our daily stand-ups is I'm going to do an information push first, share with you a few things that we're seeing and hearing across our clients as well as in general, that the intent is to focus on how we can get better in managing and supporting our teams. What I'm then going to move into are going to be a few needs challenges that we're hearing from clients and some best practices. And I open it up for you all to share your needs and challenges as well. So we can not only work to either try to address some of those here, or some of us have some different lessons that we're seeing or best practices, but also from a Persimmon perspective, we will follow up with those for the next daily stand-up as well. So we had a great several calls last week. I did a Q&A session on Monday and Tuesday, and then we started some daily stand-ups on Thursday and Friday. You know, we quickly learned a few lessons. First is that 7 a.m. was a little bit early for a few people Central Time. And the second was that at 11 a.m. Central, we were competing with the White House, depending on the day, with their own press briefing. So that was something we learned. Again, at the bottom, you have a chat that you can note. You can also raise your hand if you need to at a different point if you want to join in with the conversation. Okay, so here's what we're going to go through, and I'm going to hit going over the weekend. I hope everybody had a very safe weekend, got a little bit of time away from all of this. From the information push, I want to start, as I have every one of these calls, to remind us that leadership is what's driving success or failure in this crisis. That means as leaders, we're trying to take all of this information in, we're trying to adjust and adapt every day. And the purpose of this is to try to give you a little bit more tools, share some lessons and best practices, and also to raise up your needs. Because as Persimmon, this is what we've been focusing on for last 7+ years, is how do we manage and support as leaders our teams in an age of disruption. I do want to remind you we are recording the call, so if you would please, if you don't feel comfortable saying your company, which is totally fine, don't say your company's name. If you don't want to be on video, then hide your video. If you don't want to say something out loud, then make sure you've muted your mic as well. All right. My second item on the information push is, and this is a tough one for a lot of people I was speaking with all last week through the weekend, has been know what you can control and that which you cannot. As leaders, we're all humans, and you're trying to figure out, where do I focus my time? Where do I need to adjust certain things? How do I deal with all of this stuff that's coming at me and it's changing on a daily or hourly basis? I want us to remind ourselves, and what I'm doing even with my teams and with my clients, is stepping back and thinking about what are the things that you can control. Touching base with your team members, whether it's through phone, Teams, Skype, whatever tool you're using. Trying to build your own rhythm or the rhythms inside of your own teams. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Those are things that you can control. You can't control the world that's all going on around outside of you, but you can talk about some of those things, and that will enable you to get some better plans prepared as you're working through this. So a couple things I'm hearing from companies. First is that most have or are moving wherever possible remote workers to becoming more remote. And I was really surprised, even still by the back end of last week, there were still a lot of companies that were still just kind of getting over shell shock on this and trying to decide, can they move remote? What should they do? But as we've even heard at the national levels, depending on your state, at the state levels, we are seeing states taking more action towards either shutting down and or locking down their organizations and their citizens. At the national level, we're hearing more conversation to please, even beyond the social distancing, remembering that it's got to be who you're interacting with, where they've been, and are they isolating or quarantining themselves. And caused a lot of companies now moving very quickly into a remote environment, or at least preparing for that. From that, what we're seeing are two things, and I've been hearing quite a bit of. The first is that people are starting to settle in this week into whatever this new normal, and no one knows with certainty when this is going to pass or go. We're going to go back to the way we were 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. I hear a lot of leaders trying to put about a 4 to 6 week plan in place, saying we need to be thinking about the way we're operating, communicating, and interacting for those next 6 weeks to possibly up to 4 months. And I say that meaning that it does not mean you have to act on that, but you need to be considering that. The second one is around business viability, is what I'm hearing a lot from business leaders. The concern about liquidity and hoping that at the federal level, they're going to see some action this week, but that's also leading to questions around staffing. Some organizations are doing layoffs. Some are trying to resolve if they're going to do furloughs. They're trying to understand what are they getting from the federal or national level. How does that relate in their current decisions? And if there is going to be in some states as already a lockdown or shutdown, then knowing at least that affects everyone across the board, but it still begs the question of how do we ensure our employees are taken care of, how they are funded. And that is being coupled with the decisions that say, how do I try to maintain operational stability during this period of time? So am I going to have to cut back in my business with my customers? What's my customer impacts? What do I do internally while I'm trying to get there? The good news is what I've been hearing so far from a lot of my clients have been they're shifting into that remote wherever they can, and they are trying to focus as well on where can we start also getting some things in place, preparing for this anywhere from 6 week to 4 month plus new normal, and how do I make sure that we're doing a better job? That's what I'm hearing from a lot of clients, at least. My last two items I want to leave you all with on the information push. The first is that if your team is not discussing worst case scenarios, you should be. Does not mean you have to act on any of these, but we've already seen, and I've heard from so many companies that got caught flat-footed in not being prepared for moving into a remote situation. They're not thinking in terms of some of the expectations leaders need to make sure they have with their employees as they move to a non-physical environment. And lastly is also then trying to say, how are you handling your employees to ensure that you're protecting their safety and their caring, not just physical, but also mental and emotional, because this is the stuff that's going to decide how successful our organizations come out of this period of time as well. So thinking about basics of loss of internet, loss of building access, or a couple I heard even last week, that if you haven't been talking about those and you haven't addressed them, you need to be talking about them and thinking about what those scenarios look like. I think now the one I would add in addition to that is, as we've seen now, at least as of this morning, 9 states go into a lockdown. We need to look at what that looks like for our non-essential functions and businesses to move into that kind of state of the economy. What's it going to look like if people have to all be home? And it is going to hurt across the board, but as leadership, we can be thinking about what some of those options are, not just to operate, but to keep engaged with our employees. And so my focus challenge for you all this week, with all of this coming, and I think we're going to get a lot more information coming at our national level to give us some of the answers we're hoping for, is focus on getting your communications and your basic rhythms of interacting, scheduling the work in your day with your team as well. Calls that we talked about last week, how to do some daily stand-up calls similar to this that bring people together, that allow you to push some information out and then pull some information from your team. That is what I recommend this week you focus on if you're not already. Get some of those rhythms in place. One of the things my team did last week, which I thought was great and I loved, was on Friday at 4 o'clock Central, or 4:30, we had a happy hour, all digital. We've been working remote for an entire week. It allowed us to play some games, to do some things as a team, everybody in their own way. And it was a great opportunity to say this doesn't have to all just be about work, and it doesn't have to all be about negativity. It allows us to say as a team, how do we find some areas that we can still be and feel like a team, even though we may be in a digital environment? So With that, if you've got any questions so far with what I put on the information push, please type those into the chat, or you can come into the conversation real quick as I shift us over into some needs and best practices. So I'm gonna take a couple of minutes, or a minute or so. I'm gonna give you all a moment if you've got questions or a need or a challenge that you're experiencing that you'd like to share, that I can bring into some of the conversation in the chat as well. Okay, and while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and put up a basic poll question. Oops, bring this back. Stop this share for just a moment, and I am going to put up a poll question. Well, let's see as we do that. Okay, so what I want to move in, Corey, do we have any questions that came in yet?
No. Well, I have this one question from LinkedIn talking about communication. You spoke
Sure.
about communicating through your teams and how important it was. And this says, what platforms has your team been using and which ones have been the most successful?
Sure. So a couple of things, I'm going to share a little bit of that today, actually, as we go into a best practice. A great question on some of the ways that we're not just communicating as a team from a technology side, but also how we can approach some of this from an execution. And I'm going to share two approaches that have come out of, at least from my team's lessons this week, that I want to share with you all as best practices, and then I want to open this up for any ideas that you all want to share as well from a best practices perspective. So let me share my screen real quick. And by the way, as I go through this, if there is anything that you would like to see or have afterwards, we're going to make some of these available. So let me show you what we've got a couple of. First is, as we shifted into a full online remote environment last week, one of the pieces of feedback that we heard loud and clear is we were all struggling trying to get the information and handle all these channels of information coming at us. One of the things that we found that was feedback from our team members for those with kids was, I need 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to be able to deal with my kids once an hour at least. I need to be able to go to the restroom, because it was so easy with all of these technology choices for us to quickly just flip over and just every time we thought of a question, we could go and we could execute it with somebody else. So we had to bring a little bit of discipline in that. So one of the things that came out of the feedback from our team, and we asked our team, what were some of the feedback, even in the first week, that we need to change or improve? One of those was, please try and take 1-hour meetings and schedule them for only 45 to 50 minutes. And so in doing that, that would give a 10-minute break or a 15-minute break to go see if the kids have destroyed the house. I was sitting with a client, for some of you from last week, I started the story, but I was sitting with actually a vendor of ours that we're working with. And as we're talking with her, she has a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And the 2-year-old is just, I guess, pulling baby wipes out of the container, where she finally says, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have such a mess to deal with. And our comment was, look, do what you have to. We're all trying to figure out the new level of this adjustment. So in that case, thinking of how to bring in a little bit of time that gives some pause between meetings can be helpful. All right. The second item that I want to share with you all today, and then I want to open it up for other needs or any best practices you have, is around virtual communications. So one of the things that we did was we created a virtual communications kind of rules of engagement. And I want to show you, because it's going to help answer the question that Corey related from LinkedIn. So let me bring this up. I'm going to show you. Okay. This is an output that we created in the middle of the week. We reviewed this with our team of how we could kind of start to get a little bit more control on all of our different channels and when we should use certain channels and such. This is something I'm happy to share with you all, but I would say make it your own. Find something like this and engage your team in the conversation. So this was our virtual communications, how not to go insane. I'm just going to hit this at a very high level so you get a sense of what we did. We are using Teams primarily for a lot of our communications, and then we're using Outlook. But in that very first few days, we were getting flooded with text, chats in Teams, emails, phone calls. We were still using Skype in some cases, and people were getting kind of hammered on all these approaches. So what we said was internal use is primarily going to be on Teams. And we created this as guidance also, kind of as an approach. External was going to be used for, is what we would use Outlook for, and especially if we needed to hold on to certain information, if a channel was going to get deleted. The second that we did was some basic golden rules. We reviewed these with the teams. We adapted them slightly, but we said to our team, if you need to get a hold of somebody quickly, here's how you need to go about doing that. So high urgency communications, that means you need to text or get on the phone with someone. If it's high urgency and complex, meaning like we may have 3 or 4 people that need to be in that conversation, or we need to really talk through this, let's get a Teams call, because then we can get everybody working through that solution quickly. And we're finding that's working extremely well versus have a conversation with one person and then have another one with another person. That just eats up time and it's not efficient. And then lastly, what we put in was if we have less urgent communications, we're going to do those to a scheduled, meaning we're still using Outlook as our calendar device, and we're setting up a Teams call for it. And then we can use email for certain official communications or external comms. So that was a really simple down and dirty when we showed this with our team of this is what this could look like for you and your organization. Here's our basic golden rules of when you should apply certain communication channels. We then went a little further on how we're using Teams and specifically a little dive into it, because our team had started using Teams, but not at the level that we needed to in a remote environment. So we gave a little bit of guidance there. We gave some best practices and some tips that our team could go back to and refer as they were starting to use the tools themselves. And this was all input coming from different people and feedback as we worked through that. Then lastly, we put some best practices around conversations and showing with some things that we could do inside of Teams itself as we were working through this. So we were giving feedback to our own team and building our own lessons and rules of engagement as we proceeded forward. So that's kind of what it was. It was essentially a 7-slide, 6-slide that we then shared in our Teams environment, and it gave us the ability of being able to get information out to our team quickly, get some rules of engagement so we weren't all losing our minds, and improve our team and adapt our approach very quickly as we were working through this. So I hope that was helpful. If you're interested in getting access to it, we're happy to share that piece. Let me know, and we'll put it here. We have it in the recording, and then we could also make this available for you as well. With that, for the daily stand-up, what I want to ask is then, are there any current challenges or needs that you would like to share with us, either to be able to speak to today or to be able to address in future stand-ups? Or are there any lessons or best practices that you'd like to share? And if you would, and you want to do it live, feel free to unmute your microphone or your video that you have there.
Bill, this is Casey. I'll chime in with something that I'm often guilty of and that I've been trying to work to improve on. Is I have been doing this so long that forwarding documents seems like a normal practice to me,
Okay.
whereas sharing them via Microsoft Teams or Google Docs, where multiple people have access to the document, really improves workflow, and also takes into account that not everybody is going to be able to look over someone's shoulder or have those in the office stand-ups that we would normally have. For us being a global business, it's something that we've done for a long time, but I've found over the last week, it's become even more important for me to remember, don't hit forward, hit share. Really simple, but I think it's something that's useful.
That's a great point, Casey. Casey, are you doing that for both editing in the documents and also just for what you would have normally done in the past of forwarding the document for review? Are you doing that for both?
Doing it for both,
Okay.
simply because, I mean, it's one thing to try to keep things in sync when you're communicating with one person, but when you need multiple team members across multiple time zones, it's really much more effective just to share. And with track changes, there obviously it's easy to
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
it. Keep,
No, that's a great point. I'll tell you, one of the things that we've been continuing to kind of work through is getting our team channel set up so that we can get the right people involved in the conversations. And then what we're doing in addition is we've been starting to bring in with our SharePoint side where we are accessing certain SharePoint libraries where we know we've got certain documents that are also being stored to also kind of accomplish what you're saying, which means we know we're not also running into risk that we are not keeping our versions intact as well. So great point. And thank you for sharing. Any other needs, challenges? Okay, we've got a question I see in the chat here from Arturo, which is around for the loss of internet worst case scenario. What are some things that we're hearing companies coming up with to prepare for this? That's a great question, Arturo. So it kind of depends on the company. So a couple of things that I'm seeing out there. One is the access of flipping on hotspots and knowing who key individuals are, that if you don't have access to the internet, I'm talking primarily to your residents is what I'm referring to, is that can you stand up hotspots and who in your organization needs to be able to do that? That is a big question that I think is out there. The other one has been, we've seen in our cases where I live and with my team, some areas of our city, we've seen degradation at times. We've seen some outages, but we've seen some level of recovery. So I think one of the first things that you want to make sure with your team is that if they do go into an outage, are they able to access still via their phones? So I've had one of my team members who has had 2 outages in 4 days. And the first thing that he does is we get a pop-up that he sends out via Teams right now that says, I'm down on the internet again. And for now, know that my responsiveness may be a little bit slow. I'd like to ask for those that are on the call, does anyone else have ideas or what you're hearing inside your own teams of if you were to lose access or have poorly or greatly degraded access at your home and you're in a remote situation, what are you all doing as well to come up with practices to engage people without that residential access? So silence on that one. Here's a comment from Jill, which is having backup people to lead meetings in case someone's internet is out. That's great. That's a really good point of knowing, do you have a secondary? As we've been working through even these calls, we've had it where if another person had to step in and take over from a hosting perspective, how we can do that as well. I'll tell you from my personal perspective, I'm fortunate enough to have an iPad in addition. So when I get prepared for a call like this, I have Teams on all of my devices, but with using like a Zoom as an example, I have access and have it ready to go on my iPad should I have my residential service go down as well. And that's going just through my cellular data on that piece of it. And I know not everybody has that access. Key points I would say on that is, do people know in those situations what they should do as a first 1 or 2 steps? And then second, from a leadership perspective, if you saw that you had a substantial or prolonged outage, how would you go about reestablishing connections across individuals? All right. Any others? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I actually had this happen to me last week, right in the middle of an internal presentation. And so I failed over to my hotspot and kept on going. But what I didn't take into account is that the latency was terrible. And so I was talking and everybody was hearing me garbled up. So what I should have been doing was stopping about once every 30 seconds and saying, can everybody still hear me okay? It's just simple things like that if you fail over.
That's great, Casey. Thank you for sharing. Another one that I saw that came up in the chat's a good idea, which is that if you really are having consistent issues on that, do you need to look at having some meetings outside the normal business hours when the traffic may be higher? I think one of the big challenges this week, so where I'm at in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I have 2 sons that are home right now, one who is a senior in high school, whose school is starting to start up, and from his perspective, where he's at, and my second son, who is in college, who was on spring break when all this happened, and he's about to start online classes on Wednesday. So as a family, we now have a chart that shows when everyone's classes are, so we can try to balance our internet access between each other as well if we were to have an issue. And then also we've already been discussing as a family options between the hard lining versus the Wi-Fi if we start seeing a degradation in our different efforts. So to me, having those conversations, if you are worth having, so you just have a good sense of where things are. And I hope we never have to execute on them, but like Casey already brought up in his example, and I brought up with some of my team, we're going to have those. I'm incredibly impressed with how solid our internet providers have been to date in general, with all things that are coming at them. So we'll keep fingers crossed on that. Okay. If there's not anything else, I want to wrap up today then with kind of what we've got coming up next. Guy, thank you. I will bring that up for a good happy hour team building activities. That's the kind of stuff I want to hear, because on Wednesday then, okay, Wednesday, I'll bring in some ideas, including examples and websites that you can access to help your team have some happy hour team building activities. I am not going to be bringing the beverages of choice. That's up to you all. But I will share some of those examples for you. Tomorrow, what I want to share is, if you're interested, same link, same information. From 12:30, we're going to go to 1:30. Amy Franco is another thought leader, very focused around the business development and sales perspectives. She's got a bestseller that she wrote last year. She's going to be joining us, and together the two of us are going to talk around how you can use social capital to be able to thrive during this period. And we're going to take it from a couple of different approaches. I put the description up here that it went out. So again, same link, same call, except that we're going to be a 1 hour, 45 minute, an hour for those that may have additional questions and answers. But I want you to share and think about this for your own teams. She's going to speak to it from a sales and business development. How do you get sales teams that are used to closing deals? What do they need to be thinking about? And relationship wise, how do they need to keep those relationships going with their customers during this period of time? I'm going to talk some about the operational and employee aspects. What can we do to make sure we're maintaining social capital operationally? And so from that, we want to give you and some of your team some ideas of what we're seeing and hearing across all of the clients that we all work with, Amy and myself, and to bring that back. So keep that in mind. Share this out if you find this helpful. Please let us know in the chat if today's session was helpful as well. The recording is going to be available. And I appreciate everyone's time today, and I wish you and your families and your teams a safe and prosperous week. Thank you.